morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be. And this is another post about books. It's called Inventing a Genre. What does it mean to invent a genre? I think it only means that an author is doing original work. And if original work has become rare in the modern age, that is a symptom of a larger problem. A young Chilean man has been celebrated for inventing a genre that looked a lot like historical fiction to me. But what do I know? I need to look more closely. The book's name is When We Cease to Understand the World, and it's by Benjamin Lavatoot. He lives in Chile, and he was born in Belgium. Since the premise of this 180-page book sounded like it would equally well apply to a book that I wrote 2 years ago, and since the marketing materials sounded a lot like marketing material I wrote for a book I wrote 2 years ago, I thought I'd take a closer look. The Guardian described this book as an extraordinary non-fiction novel that weaves a web of associations between the founders of quantum mechanics and the evils of the two worlds. That could equally well describe my book, so I'm curious. And my marketing materials said, "This is not a single story with a single storyline. This is a web of thought, and it is best read in that fashion by surfing from idea to idea and weaving your own web of associations." So both of our books are about physics history, and given what I've learned about the black market for books, my paranoia immediately leads me to wonder if this young tattooed Chilean man actually wrote this book, or if he bought it off of the black market to impress his parents or his girlfriend. In his acknowledgments section, he wrote that his girlfriend was his primary consultant for the book. And it's a very academic text that draws from rather a wide array of obscure sources written in English that would be difficult to find in Chile. Now, polyglot geniuses exist, and he was born in Belgium, but it just seemed odd to me that such a work would be produced outside of an academic institution, and that all of the references would be obscure books that had been published in English, not Spanish. And some of it's about people from Germany, and a lot of the texts would have been difficult to find even in Germany. In the same way that one author took my novel and rewrote it as a socialist men's rights activism diatribe, and in the same way that another author took my novel and rewrote it without the ambiguously revolutionary sentiments, I wondered if whoever supported Lavatoot's book may have published it as a reaction to recent popular accounts about how Einstein's wife was responsible for many of the insights attributed to her husband. I wondered this because Lavatoot's book turns this notion upside down, replacing it with the creative speculation that Einstein's key insight should be attributed to a soldier on the battlefield of World War I, scribbling physics in the trenches. It sounds a lot like 1984 played out in real time. From this perspective, now I understand what is meant by inventing a genre. It means inventing history that never happened, and making no effort to source claims whatsoever. After reading Lavatoot's preposterously heroic life histories of Schwarzschild and Grothendieck, I wonder if those men actually existed or if they were created to serve as a face for a body of work collected from nameless dead people. One way to preserve work that would ordinarily fall into obscurity is to publish it under a famous name. This book by Lavatoot was published by Pushkin Press, and I wonder, who are they? What is their agenda? Is this satire? What really worries me is how uncritically the media apparatus appraised this work. It was advertised essentially by reviews published in newspapers in both Britain and Germany. And no one stood up to say, Mr. Lavatoot, you have suggested that a soldier gave Einstein the solution to general relativity, when the consensus among academic physicists is that the final steps in the derivation were given to him by a mathematician named Hilbert. Your premise is idiotic. Nobody said this, and I was further bothered by this book because his romanticism about Schrödinger and Heisenberg's genius and their search for a theory of everything is equally absurd. It seems drawn straight from popular science texts that have no grounding whatsoever in the academic tradition. Not only is the myth of a search for a theory of everything a popular science invention that any reasonable physicist understands is a joke about how relative and absolute conceptions of space and time have led people to use incompatible axioms throughout the history of physics. Dirac thought that Schrödinger was a poser who tried to pass off as his own a 100-year-old equation from Sophie Germain. So I have in the blog post linked below, you can find a link to a Scientific American article written by Paul Dirac, in which he says Schrödinger discovered this equation simply by looking for an equation with mathematical beauty. Not only did he not derive it, Schrödinger and his colleagues were unable to give the equation a reasonable interpretation for 2 years. Now, how often does a mathematical description of a physical system appear out of thin air but lack a physical interpretation? So, and this was Schrödinger's was romanticized in Lavatoot's book as he's sitting in, I can't remember it anymore, but it was the standard popular science story of the lone genius with his eureka moment, which is absurd. That's just not how it works. There is a pattern associated with great physicists, and people like Lavatoot who romanticize their stories do us a great disservice. Isaac Newton stole his conceptual understanding from Hooke and his mathematical understanding from Leibniz, and then dedicated the rest of his life to trashing their reputations. Albert Einstein took his wife's and professors' nuanced explanations and turned them into a horrific mashup of Minkowski's, Poincaré's, and Heaviside's understanding of space and time. Max Planck solved the ultraviolet catastrophe by quantizing energy according to ideas from Boltzmann, a man who killed himself because his colleagues treated him like a crackpot. James Clerk Maxwell took Faraday's understanding of electricity and magnetism and formalized it without emphasizing that his equations made critical approximations. Galileo Galilei stole from Giordano Bruno, and while Bruno was executed for heresy, Galileo got away with house arrest. Galileo then used this opportunity to write about his ideas. Then you have Niels Bohr working as a postdoc for Rutherford and expanding his atomic model with a myopic approximation that confused the mathematical map and the territory. Next we have Richard Feynman, a man that Gell-Mann refused to work with after Feynman took the fruits of one of their conversations and wrote up the ideas as his own. He essentially created a Rube Goldberg machine method of calculating simple scattering cross-sections. Werner Heisenberg took ideas from Emmy Noether and expressed them as his own in his own private language without crediting her. the uncertainty principle is an obvious combination of Noether's theorem and Zeno's paradox. Next you have Paul Dirac. He started out great, but when they offered him the Nobel Prize, he gave up on defending a sensible interpretation of his work and succumbed to the pressure to tell everyone that his equation predicted a stupid concept called antimatter. Last we have Erwin Schrödinger. He got a wave equation named after him that had been invented more than 100 years earlier by a woman named Sophie Germain. He was unable to interpret the meaning of the equation for years after he invented it, or found it, rather. Now, tell me again that these were great men. I mean, this is a hall of shame. But none of this gets to the heart of what bothered me about Lavatoot's book. Lavatoot's text just goes too deep without being well sourced. For example, when he wrote on page 16, "The plan timidly put into place by Frederick the Great was taken up with violence 150 years later by the Third Reich. The Nazis planted millions of such trees in abandoned fields and residential quarters, in schoolyards and cemeteries, in the grounds of hospitals and sanatoria, and on both sides of the highways that crisscrossed the new Germany. They distributed guides and manuals of all kinds to small farmers, detailing the state-sanctioned techniques for harvesting and processing of silkworms. They were to be suspended over a vessel of boiling water for more than 3 hours, the minimum time required to kill them without damaging the precious material of the cocoons they had woven around themselves. Frisch himself included this procedure in an appendix to his magnum opus, an 18-tome work to which he dedicated the last 20 years of his life." Now, the idea about processing silkworms sounds a lot like the process of, creating PhD students and extracting work for them. But what bothers me is the specificity of this historical anecdote. How did this young Chilean man get access to this 18-tome work written in Old German? It surely doesn't exist in every library in the world, especially not in Chile. If this book, Lavatoot's book, had been produced within an academic institution, and if it had been well sourced, I would believe that it came from a young tattooed Chilean man in a leather jacket. But something about it just looks off to me. It looks like the work of more than one person. After I finished the book, I was worried. If you zoom in on the text, it's all lies, ridiculous lies. Yet, if you zoom out, there is a truth conveyed in the book, and it is very disturbing. The final chapter lets the reader in on the cruel joke that all of the stories about the famous scientists were ridiculous heroic fabrications. But it says a lot more than that. It tells us that once one discovers the lies with which history is constructed, one may suffer any number of terrible fates. One may end as the woman who hung herself from an oak tree she nurtured. No one knew why she did it. One may end as a pair of poisoned dogs. No one knew why they were poisoned. One may end as a night gardener, responsible for pruning back the growths of the tree of knowledge that are unwanted. This left me with the thought that if truth is beauty, then this book has the sort of beauty possessed by a Medusa. Thank you for listening to my out-of-the-box thoughts, which can justifiably be called slightly crazy, but I think it's important to stretch a little bit and think a bit past what we actually know for sure. In this age of fake news, you have to. So, thanks for watching.